Hey guys, tonight we're going to be talking about something a little different. Something that might make you grateful for the quiet hum of your own bedroom. We're diving into a time when a bad day wasn't just a missed deadline or a coffee spill. No, a bad day could be you, your family, and everyone you know being turned into a spider, or a tree, or maybe just having your crops spontaneously combust into a pillar of fire. The kind of bad day that came straight from Mount Olympus and was delivered with a smile by a god who decided you were a little bit too arrogant for your own good. This isn't your friendly neighbourhood pantheon. This is the Roman pantheon. And trust me, you probably wouldn't survive a single Tuesday in ancient Rome if you weren't constantly watching your back. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a Roman citizen, a simple, ordinary life. Maybe you're a farmer, watching the sun beat down on your fields of wheat, the stalks swaying in the gentle breeze. Maybe you're a baker, kneading dough in the early morning light, the smell of fresh bread filling the air. Or perhaps you're a craftsman, the rhythmic tap, tap, tap of your hammer echoing in the narrow streets of Rome. You have your daily struggles, your worries about money, your arguments with your neighbours, but woven into every single moment of your existence is an intricate, often terrifying, relationship with a pantheon of gods who are, to put it mildly, not always on your side. Forget the sanitized versions you've seen in movies, the ones where the gods are just a group of powerful but mostly benevolent figures, doling out favours and lightning bolts with a sort of cosmic sense of justice. That's a modern interpretation, a soft focused lens on a hard-edged reality. To the average Roman, the gods were fickle, easily offended and intensely personal. They weren't distant, abstract concepts. They were a part of your daily life, and you had to walk on eggshells around them. One wrong word, one missed offering, one arrogant thought, and you could find your entire world turned upside down. It's an understanding built on fear, a deep-seated reverence that bordered on dread. The gods of Rome were not your friends. They weren't your buddies. They were your masters, and you existed at their whim. The very air you breathe, the food you eat, the water you drink, it was all a gift from them, and they could just as easily take it away. They were a reflection of the brutal, unforgiving world the Romans lived in, a world of plagues, of famines, of constant warfare, a world where you prayed for a good harvest and sacrificed to the river god to keep the floods at bay. You did this not because you loved them, but because you were terrified of what they would do if you didn't. Let's start with the big one. The head honcho, the king of the gods himself, Jupiter. He's the Roman equivalent of Zeus, the god of the sky and thunder. When the sky darkens and a storm rolls in, you're not just seeing a weather phenomenon, you're seeing Jupiter's mood. A gentle rain might be a blessing, a sign of his contentment, but a thunderbolt, that's a message, a sign of his displeasure. And you better believe someone, somewhere, is about to have a very, very bad day. This isn't a god who's content to just sit on his throne and watch. He's actively involved, and his temper is legendary. One of the most famous tales involves the story of Salmonis, a mortal king who, in his arrogance, dared to impersonate Jupiter. He had his chariots drag bronze pots behind them to mimic thunder and threw torches to simulate lightning. Jupiter, not one to appreciate a cheap imitation, struck him down with a real thunderbolt, utterly obliterating him and his city. It's a classic cautionary tale. You don't mess with the boss, and you certainly don't try to steal his thunder. But the fear of the gods wasn't just about avoiding a dramatic, Hollywood-style death. It was about the subtle, insidious ways they could ruin your life. Take Venus, for instance. She's the goddess of love, beauty, and fertility. Sounds nice, right? You'd think she'd be the one you could rely on for a little warmth and affection. But in ancient Rome, love wasn't a simple, fluffy feeling. It was a chaotic, dangerous force, and Venus was its master. Offend her, and she could make you fall hopelessly in love with someone who despises you, or she could turn your beloved against you, poisoning your relationship from the inside out. Her power was a double-edged sword, and while she could bless a marriage, she could just as easily curse it, turning what should have been a source of joy into a source of endless heartache. The story of Psyche and Cupid is a perfect example. Psyche, a mortal princess of immense beauty, inadvertently earns Venus's wrath simply by being too beautiful. Instead of just smiting her, Venus decides to play a long, drawn-out, psychologically torturous game, using her son Cupid to make Psyche suffer. It's a terrifyingly passive-aggressive form of divine vengeance, a slow and agonizing destruction of everything you hold dear. And it wasn't just the big names you had to worry about. The Roman pantheon was vast, a sprawling bureaucracy of divine beings, each with their own domain and their own potential for revenge. You had to be careful with Mercury, the swift-footed messenger of the gods and the patron of commerce. While he could bring you good fortune in business, he was also a trickster god. Offend him, and your trade deals could fall through, your money could vanish, or your messages could get hopelessly twisted, causing untold chaos in your life. He was a god of boundaries and transitions, and disrespecting him could mean being forever lost between places, unable to find your way home. The concept of pietas was central to the Roman worldview. This wasn't just about being pious in the modern sense of the word. It was a complex, multi-layered duty. You had a pietas to the gods, to your family, and to the state. It was about respect, duty, and the proper observance of rituals. You had to perform the correct sacrifices, say the correct prayers, and follow the correct procedures. It was all about maintaining the pax deorum, the peace of the gods. If you failed, if you were careless or arrogant or disrespectful, you risked breaking that peace, and the consequences could be catastrophic. Historians still debate whether the Romans truly believed the gods were as capricious as the myths suggest, or if the stories were a tool for social control, a way to enforce order and conformity in a chaotic world. But for the average Roman on the street, the threat felt very, very real. Imagine it, you're walking through the Forum, the heart of Rome. You pass a temple, a grand structure of marble and stone, and you make a silent prayer, a small gesture of respect, not because you're feeling particularly spiritual, but because you're playing it safe. You're crossing your fingers, hoping you haven't accidentally angered some minor deity of crossroads or fountains. The smallest thing could set them off. You see, the gods were everywhere. They weren't confined to a distant mountain. They were in the trees, in the streams, in the ground beneath your feet, the Noumena. These invisible spirits of place were a part of the landscape, and you had to be mindful of them. You couldn't just cut down a sacred grove without a prayer of apology. You couldn't just build a bridge over a river without an offering to the river god. To do so was an act of profound disrespect, an act of impietas, and the repercussions could be dire. You might find your bridge collapsing, or your crops failing, or your well running dry. The fear wasn't just about personal misfortune, either. It was about the collective good of the state. If a plague swept through the city, or if the army suffered a devastating defeat, it was often interpreted as a sign that the gods were angry with Rome as a whole. This would lead to public rituals, sacrifices on a massive scale, and a deep, city-wide soul-searching to figure out what had gone wrong, who had offended the gods, who had broken the pax deorum. The responsibility was collective, and the fear was a shared burden. The gods were a constant, pervasive presence, and their potential for vengeance was a part of the very air you breathed. They were the ultimate authority, the final arbiters of your fate, and you learned very quickly to be very, very careful around them. It was a life lived on a knife's edge, a constant balancing act between duty, fear, and the hope that today, At least, you wouldn't do anything to catch their divine attention. It's a far cry from a world where you just pray for a good day. For the Romans, a good day was one where the gods left you alone. You're still there, in the heart of Rome, the clamour of the forum, a distant echo as you find a quiet corner to catch your breath. The air is thick with the scent of incense and sweat, a potent mix that reminds you of the gods' omnipresence. You've just finished making a small, token offering at a public shrine, a pinch of salt on a charcoal brazier, and a quick, whispered prayer to Vesta, the goddess of the hearth and home. You didn't do it because you felt particularly devout today. You did it out of habit, out of a deeply ingrained sense of self-preservation, because if Vesta's fire goes out in your home, you're not just cold, you're cursed, and you're pretty sure you'd rather deal with a drafty house than the wrath of a goddess who takes her job very, very seriously. The thing is, the Roman gods weren't just a collection of individuals with their own domains. They were part of a vast, intricate hierarchy, a divine bureaucracy with Jupiter at the top, and a million smaller deities and spirits filling in the gaps. This wasn't a democracy, it was a monarchy, a cosmic pecking order that you had to understand if you wanted to survive. Offending a major god like Jupiter was one thing, a swift, cataclysmic disaster, but offending a minor god that could be a slow, creeping kind of horror, a problem that festers and grows until it consumes your entire life. Think of it like this: Jupiter is the emperor. You don't see him every day, but his power is absolute. You're respectful when his name is mentioned. You don't break his laws, and you hope you never, ever have to deal with him directly. But then you have the provincial governors, the city magistrates, the endless parade of lesser officials. These are the gods you interact with on a daily basis. They're the ones who control the small, important details of your life, and they're the ones you're most likely to accidentally annoy. Let's talk about a few of them. Take Janus, the god of beginnings, transitions, and endings. He's the god of doorways and gates, a two-faced deity who looks both backward to the past and forward to the future. You'd think he'd be a pretty chill guy. Right. He just opens and closes things, what's the big deal? Well, in a world where every transition was fraught with danger, Janus was a god you did not want to displease. If you started a new venture, a new business, a new journey, a new marriage without the proper prayers and offerings to Janus, you were setting yourself up for failure. He could close the door on your new beginning before it even started. Your new ship could sink in a storm. Your marriage could be a constant source of strife. Your business could fail before you even made a profit. And because Janus was so central to the concept of beginnings, he was also the god of the first month of the year, January. The Romans started their year with him, a full month of rituals and observances designed to get on his good side and ensure a smooth transition into the next 12 months. Mess that up, and you're in for a very rough year. It's a good reminder that even the seemingly harmless gods had the power to make your life miserable. Then there's Mars. He's the god of war, and in the early Roman Republic, he was second only to Jupiter in importance. We tend to think of him as a god of glorious battle and military victory, but to the Romans he was much more complex. He was also the god of agriculture, a protector of the fields and a defender of the Roman people against threats both human and supernatural. He was the god you prayed to for a good harvest, as much as you prayed to him for a victorious army. Offending Mars could mean not just losing a war, but also losing your food supply. Your crops could wither and die. Your livestock could get sick, and famine could sweep through your family and your town. The Romans believed that war was a natural state, and they had to constantly appease Mars to keep him from turning his destructive power on them. They were basically saying, "Please, Mars, go and fight someone else's war. We'll give you plenty of sacrifices if you just leave our fields alone." Remember the idea of pietas from the last chapter, that was all about keeping the gods happy. The Romans took this very seriously. so much so that they created a whole system of rituals and ceremonies designed to appease the divine. They didn't just pray, they performed vota, a kind of binding vow or promise to a god. Oh, Mars, if you grant us victory against the Gauls, we will build a temple in your honour. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was a contract. If Mars delivered, and you failed to build that temple, you were in serious trouble. You were in breach of contract with a god. And you know how bad it is when you're in a breach of a contract with a mortal person. Right, imagine that. But with a guy who can strike you down with a magical spear, it's a terrifying thought. A constant low-level anxiety that you're just one forgotten promise away from total ruin. The gods weren't just powerful, they were present. They had specific temples dedicated to them. Yes, but they also had an unofficial presence in every part of Roman life, the Lares. For example, these were the household gods, the spirits of the ancestors, and they resided in a small shrine in the home, called the Lararium. Every morning, the family would offer a small bit of food and wine to the Lares to ensure the prosperity and protection of the home. It was a tiny, simple ritual, but a profoundly important one. Neglect the Lares, and you were neglecting your own family's foundation. You might find your crops failing, your children getting sick, your home falling into disrepair. The gods were a constant, daily part of Roman life, not just for the big, city-wide festivals, but for the intimate, private moments too. The hierarchy extended all the way down to the spirits of the fields, the forests and the rivers. The Romans weren't stupid. They knew that a river could flood, a forest could catch fire, and a field could be struck by blight. But they didn't see these things as random acts of nature. They saw them as the actions of a god who was either displeased or simply ignored. So when you're a farmer, you're not just thinking about the weather, you're thinking about the local river god, hoping he stays in his bed and doesn't decide to overflow and wash away your entire harvest. You're offering him a small libation, a little bit of wine poured into the water, just to be on the safe side. This is where the less known details come in. Roman religion wasn't just about the big, public sacrifices, it was also about the private, personal rituals. The Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, was a powerful figure, but so was the head of every household, who served as a kind of private priest for his own family. The rituals were everywhere. A farmer's calendar was a religious one, with certain days dedicated to different gods, and certain tasks forbidden on certain days. It was a life lived in constant consultation with the divine, a perpetual series of small negotiations to ensure your continued survival. The Romans were, in a very real sense, always at work, even when they were just trying to live their lives. Historians still debate the degree to which these beliefs were genuinely held by all Romans, or if they were more of a social glue, a way of enforcing norms and giving people a sense of shared identity and purpose. It's an interesting question, and one we probably won't ever get a definitive answer to. But what's clear is that the fear of offending a god, any god, was a powerful motivator. It shaped their society, their laws and their daily lives. The Romans were nothing if not pragmatic, and they saw a deep practical wisdom in keeping the gods happy. It was a form of cosmic insurance, and while it might have been a pain to remember all the rituals and prayers, it was a whole lot better than the alternative. So, you're a Roman citizen. You're not a hero. You're not a king. You're just a person trying to get by. You're navigating a world where a misplaced thought can lead to divine retribution, and a forgotten ritual can cause a plague. You're living in a society where the gods are not a distant, abstract concept, but a real and present danger, and you're hoping, with every fibre of your being, that you haven't done anything today to attract their attention. You're hoping that you can just live your life in peace. You're hoping that the gods, for once, will just leave you alone. The sun has set now, and the city of Rome is quieting down. The torches in the streets cast long, dancing shadows, and the air is cooler, carrying the distant sound of a single, lonely lyre. You're back in your small home, the warm glow of the oil lamp illuminating the faces of your family. You've had a long day, filled with the back-breaking work of daily life. Now, you sit, exhausted, but with a sense of cautious relief. You got through another day without a sign of divine displeasure, but even in this quiet moment, the gods are not far. You catch a glimpse of the small shrine to your household lares in the corner of the room, and you feel that familiar, low hum of anxiety. You know that even in the stillness of the night, the gods are watching. Remember Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, the one who could make your life a living hell just by being a little too pretty. Well, her capacity for vengeance isn't just a matter of making you fall in love with the wrong person. It's much, much worse than that. Her fury could be all-consuming, a slow and deliberate campaign to utterly dismantle your existence. The stories the Romans told about her weren't just cautionary tales. They were horror stories, designed to remind you that even the most beautiful and benevolent-seeming gods could be terrifyingly cruel. One of the most famous examples, which we touched on before, is the story of Psyche. It's a classic Greek myth that was adopted and adapted by the Romans, a story so ingrained in their culture that it served as a powerful lesson. Psyche was a mortal princess, so stunningly beautiful that people started to worship her instead of Venus. The shrines to Venus were abandoned, her altars were neglected. Imagine that, a mortal woman, a temporary inhabitant of this world, stealing the divine thunder of a goddess. Venus, as you might expect, was not pleased. This wasn't a minor slight. This was a direct challenge to her power, a deep insult that demanded a terrible response. But Venus didn't just turn Psyche into a goat, or strike her dead with a bolt of divine lightning. That would have been too quick, too simple. Instead, she decided on a more devious and psychologically brutal form of revenge. She sent her son, Cupid, the god of desire, to make Psyche fall in love with the most vile, monstrous creature in all the world. Her plan was to condemn Psyche to a life of utter misery, a grotesque parody of love. But here's the thing about the gods, they're just as fallible as mortals, if not more so. Cupid, in a classic divine misstep, accidentally pricked himself with one of his own arrows and fell in love with Psyche. The very instrument of his mother's revenge became the source of his own forbidden love. The story goes on. Of course, Cupid, hidden from his mother's sight, takes Psyche to a magical palace where he visits her only at night, in complete darkness, telling her she can never, ever look upon his face. He's protecting her from Venus's wrath. But Psyche's jealous sisters, driven by envy, convince her that her unseen lover must be a terrifying monster. In a moment of weakness, Psyche lights a lamp to see who she's been sleeping with, and a single drop of hot oil falls on Cupid. Waking him, he, feeling betrayed, flies away, and Psyche is left alone, heartbroken, and utterly vulnerable to her divine enemy. This is where the real horror begins. With Cupid gone, Psyche is left to face Venus's wrath directly. Venus, with a cold, calculating fury, sets out to destroy Psyche, not with a single act of violence, but with a series of impossible tasks. She's not just punishing Psyche, she's toying with her. The tasks are designed to be humiliating and impossible, a testament to Venus's cruelty. The first task sought a massive pile of mixed grains, wheat, barley, millet, poppies before nightfall, a task so immense, so mind-numbingly tedious, that it's designed to break a mortal spirit. It's a great example of a less-known detail. The power of the gods wasn't just in their cosmic abilities, but in their ability to manipulate the mundane, to turn a simple task into an insurmountable obstacle. Luckily for Psyche, she gets help from a colony of ants, but Venus isn't done. The second task is to fetch a fleece of gold from a flock of violent, man-eating sheep. Again, seemingly impossible. Psyche is saved by a speaking reed that tells her to wait for the sheep to rub their wool on the thorns of a bush, so she can gather the fleece without being killed. The third task is to get a jar of water from a spring at the top of a mountain, guarded by a dragon. This time, an eagle helps her. The final and most terrifying task is to descend into the underworld and ask Proserpina, the queen of the underworld, for a box containing a small amount of her divine beauty. Now, this is the kicker. You're told to go to the land of the dead, a place no mortal can go and return from unscathed. You're told not to open the box you're given. And what does Psyche do? In a final moment of mortal weakness and curiosity, she opens the box. Inside, there isn't beauty. There's a Stygian sleep, a deep death-like slumber that instantly overtakes her. Venus's plan was never just to humiliate Psyche. It was to destroy her, slowly, painfully, and ultimately to make her the instrument of her own demise. It's a chilling reminder that divine vengeance isn't about fairness or a quick death. It's about a long, protracted, and utterly miserable existence. This story isn't just about a jealous goddess. It's about the Roman understanding of love and beauty as powerful and dangerous forces. For the Romans, Venus wasn't just a symbol of romance. She was a goddess of intense passion, the kind that could drive a person to madness, the kind that could lead to wars. Remember the story of the Trojan War, which was caused by Paris choosing Venus as the most beautiful goddess. She was a force of nature, and you had to be extremely careful how you dealt with her. To offend Venus was to invite chaos and emotional destruction into your life. It wasn't just a matter of being turned into a tree, it was a matter of having your very heart, your very essence, twisted and broken. The historians still debate whether the Roman myths were simply inherited from the Greeks and adapted, or if they reflected a deeper, more primal understanding of the world, while many of the stories, like Psyche's, are of Greek origin. The way the Romans told them and the lessons they drew from them were distinctly their own. They saw a pragmatic terror in the gods, a very real, very present danger. They saw their gods as a reflection of the tumultuous, unpredictable world they lived in, a world where love could turn to hate, where prosperity could turn to poverty, and where a single, careless mistake could lead to total ruin. So, as you lay in your bed, the faint flicker of the oil lamp a gentle reassurance. Remember the story of Psyche. Remember that even the gods of love could be filled with a terrible, spiteful vengeance. You're not just hoping for a good night's sleep. You're hoping that no one, somewhere in the city of Rome, has done anything to earn the displeasure of a deity tonight. You're hoping that Venus is feeling particularly benevolent, that she's found a new mortal to fawn over, and that you and your family can just be left in peace. The silence of the night isn't a sign of peace. It's a sign that the gods, for now, are simply looking the other way. The quiet of the night is settling in, but you're finding it hard to drift off. A low wind has picked up, a sort of mournful whistling that snakes through the cracks in your shutters. It reminds you of the sea, the vast unpredictable ocean that defines the edge of the known world. And that, of course, brings to mind Neptune, the god of the sea, the god of all water, really freshwater streams, lakes, even the groundwater that feeds the wells. You remember a story your father told you, a story about a fisherman who, in his haste, forgot to make a small offering to Neptune before setting out to sea. His boat never returned. Was it a coincidence, a bad storm? Maybe. But you, as a Roman, know better. You know it was Neptune, a god whose mood was as unpredictable and dangerous as the waves he commanded. Neptune, or Poseidon as the Greeks called him, was not a god you messed with. His domain was a place of mystery and immense power. The sea was Rome's lifeline, the highway for trade, the route for military campaigns, and the source of a lot of food. But it was also hostile. alien environment, and Neptune was its undisputed king. You didn't just sail on the ocean, you entered his kingdom. And you did so as a guest, a humble visitor who had to show the proper respect. To do otherwise was to invite a slow, terrifying form of punishment. Think about it from a Roman perspective. You're a merchant, and you've just spent months gathering a valuable cargo of grain, wine, and olive oil. You've invested everything you have, and your entire family's future rests on this single shipment. Before the ship leaves port, you make a grand sacrifice to Neptune, maybe a bull, maybe a smaller animal if you're not that wealthy, but you make sure the offering is seen as generous and sincere. You pray for a calm sea, for a quick journey, for a safe return. You're not doing this out of love for Neptune, you're doing it out of a deep-seated terror of what he could do if you didn't. Because if you were to, say, cheap out on the sacrifice, or if you were to boast in the tavern that your sailing skill was what would get you to your destination, you were in for a world of hurt. Neptune's fury wasn't always a dramatic, ship-smashing storm. Sometimes it was more subtle, more insidious. Maybe your ship would get lost in a fog that seemed to last for weeks, its sails hanging limp in the still, unmoving air. You'd run out of food and water, the desperation growing with each passing day. The very lack of a storm could be a form of divine punishment. A slow, agonizing death by thirst and starvation. Or maybe your rudder would mysteriously break in the middle of the ocean, a seemingly random accident that left you adrift and helpless, at the mercy of the currents. One of the most famous stories involving Neptune's wrath is from the Odyssey, a story the Romans knew well and held in high regard. The hero, Odysseus, blinds Neptune's son, the Cyclops Polyphemus, and then foolishly shouts his name as he sails away. "I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca," he brags. This is a classic case of mortal hubris, and Neptune does not take it kindly. He then spends the next 10 years of Odysseus' life tormenting him, sending storms to wreck his ships, creating whirlpools to suck him into the depths, and generally making his life a living hell. The lesson here is clear: don't offend the son of a god, and definitely don't brag about it afterwards. The gods have long memories, and they do not forgive easily. The fear of Neptune wasn't just for sailors. Remember that he's the god of all water, in a city like Rome, which depended on aqueducts to bring fresh water from miles away. This was a very real, very daily concern. The water that flowed into your home, that you used to cook and clean, that you drank to quench your thirst, it was all a gift from Neptune. And you better believe that the engineers who built the aqueducts made ample sacrifices to the water gods, praying that the pipes wouldn't leak, that the flow wouldn't stop, and that the springs wouldn't run dry. A water shortage wasn't just a logistical problem. It was a divine message, a sign of Neptune's displeasure, and it would send the entire city into a panic. The one universal truth is that you can live without a lot of things, but you can't live without water. And the Romans knew that the ultimate source of that water was a god with a terrible temper. A less-known detail about Neptune is that he was also the god of horses and earthquakes. Think about that for a second. The ground beneath your feet, the very foundation of your world, could shake and tremble at his whim. An earthquake in ancient Rome wasn't a geological event. It was a direct message from Neptune, a terrifying reminder that his power extended far beyond the sea. It was a physical manifestation of his fury, a cosmic tantrum that could bring down buildings, destroy temples, and bury people alive. This duality of his power, the sea and the earth, made him a particularly terrifying figure. He controlled not just the water that gave them life, but the very ground that held them. The academic debates on this subject are fascinating. Scholars still argue about whether the Romans had a more sophisticated understanding of the gods than the myths suggest. Was the worship of Neptune a way of coming to terms with the brutal, unpredictable forces of nature? Or was it a genuine belief that these forces were controlled by a divine being with a very human-like, capacity for anger and revenge? The answer probably lies somewhere in the middle. The stories of Neptune's wrath were a way to explain the unexplainable, to give a face to the forces that could shatter a life in an instant, but they also served as a very real deterrent, a powerful reminder to the Roman people to be humble, to be respectful, and to never ever take the divine for granted. So, as you listen to the wind whistle and mourn, a sound that is both comforting and unsettling, you find yourself whispering a quiet prayer, not to Jupiter, not to Venus, but to Neptune. You ask him to keep the storms at bay, to keep the ground beneath your home steady, and to, please, just let you and your family live in peace. You know he's out there, somewhere on the vast and endless sea, and you know he's listening, and you're hoping, with every fibre of your being, that you haven't done anything to catch his attention tonight. The world outside your window is a terrifying place, a place filled with divine fury and ancient vengeance, and you're just a small, insignificant mortal, hoping to survive another day. You're deep in the quiet of the night now, the oil lamp long extinguished, and a thick darkness has settled over your home. You've been lying in bed, your eyes wide open, listening to the soft rhythmic breathing of your family. You've been thinking about the gods, about Venus and Neptune, about the terrifying power that they hold. But there's a greater power, a more profound and immediate terror that stalks the Roman imagination. It's the terror of Jupiter, the king of the gods, and the terrifying consequences of your own arrogance. To offend a lesser god is a problem. To offend Jupiter is a death sentence. The Roman concept of hubris that dangerous, arrogant pride that makes a mortal think they are equal to the gods, is a recurring theme in all their stories. It's the fatal flaw that brings down heroes and kings, and it's the one thing that can't be forgiven. Remember the story of Samoneus, the king who tried to mimic Jupiter's thunder and lightning. That wasn't just a myth, it was a core tenet of Roman belief. You do not, under any circumstances, pretend to be a god. The punishment for such a transgression is not just death, it's utter annihilation. Jupiter, in his infinite power, doesn't just kill you, he erases you. He makes it so you never existed. But the price of hubris wasn't always so dramatic. Sometimes it was more subtle, more of a long, drawn-out torment. Take the story of Arachne. This is another one of those Greek myths that the Romans adopted and made their own. Arachne was a mortal weaver, and a very good one at that. She was so skilled that people came from all over to see her tapestries. She was famous. But with that fame came a dangerous pride. She started to boast that her weaving was better than Minerva's, the goddess of crafts, wisdom, and, you guessed it, weaving. This was a massive mistake. You don't challenge a god at their own craft. Minerva, being a goddess of wisdom, decides to give Arachne a chance to recant her foolish boast. She disguises herself as an old woman and warns Arachne not to compare herself to the gods. But Arachne, in her arrogance, just scoffs at the old woman and says, "Let the goddess come down and challenge me herself." And so she does. Minerva reveals herself, and the weaving contest begins. Minerva weaves a tapestry of the gods in all their glory, a magnificent and humbling scene. Arachne, in her pride, weaves a tapestry of the gods in all their folly, showing their misdeeds and their scandals. Her work is a masterpiece, a beautiful and poignant work of art, but it's a direct insult to the gods. It's an act of pure, unadulterated hubris. Minerva, enraged not by the quality of the work, but by the sheer audacity of it, tears Arachne's tapestry to shreds. She then strikes Arachne on the head with a spindle, not to kill her, but to make her feel shame. The shame is so profound, so all-encompassing, that Arachne tries to hang herself. But Minerva, in a final, terrifying act of cruelty, decides that death is too good for her. She turns Arachne into a spider, condemning her to a life of perpetual weaving. "You will hang and you will spin," she says, "and your descendants will do the same forever." This is the ultimate Roman nightmare, not a quick, painless death, but an eternal, agonizing punishment, a living hell that you pass on to your children. The vengeance is not just for you, it's for your entire family line. This story, like so many others, served as a powerful reminder to the Roman people to be humble. The gods were not just powerful, they were also jealous and petty. They demanded respect, and they did not tolerate a challenge to their authority. The Roman way of life was built on a foundation of humility and duty, of knowing your place in the grand scheme of things. To step outside of that was to invite divine wrath, not just on yourself, but on your entire community. Another less-known detail is the Roman concept of divus, a status given to emperors after their death, essentially making them gods. This was a fascinating and complex practice. On one hand, it shows the ultimate level of respect and reverence a mortal could achieve. On the other hand, it also served as a very powerful tool of social and political control. If the emperor was a god, then to challenge him, or to speak ill of him, was an act of impietas, an offence against the gods themselves. This blurring of the lines between mortal and divine was a source of great power for the Roman state, and a constant source of anxiety for the average citizen. You had to be careful not just about the gods on Mount Olympus, but also about the ones who used to sit on the throne of Rome. The historians are still grappling with the complexities of this practice. Did the Romans genuinely believe their emperors became gods, or was it a political fiction? A convenient way to consolidate power and ensure loyalty? It's a question that gets to the heart of Roman religion. Was it a matter of sincere faith, or was it a pragmatic tool, a way of managing a vast and diverse empire? The truth, as usual, is probably a mix of both. The Romans were pragmatic people, and their religion was a pragmatic one. They believed in the gods, but they also used the gods to serve their own interests. So, as you lie in the dark, the stories of Salmoneus and Arachne echoing in your mind, you feel a deep, visceral sense of fear. It's not just a fear of a lightning bolt, it's a fear of being humbled, of being shamed, of being turned into a grotesque parody of your former self. It's a fear of being a victim of your own pride, of being brought down by a god who is as jealous as they are powerful. You're just a small, insignificant person in a world full of giants, both mortal and divine, and you know, with a chilling certainty, that the only way to survive is to stay in your lane, to be humble, and to never, ever compare yourself to a god. The silence of the night is a fragile thing, a temporary truce in a war that has been going on since the beginning of time, and you're hoping, with all your heart, that you don't do anything to break that truce. The silence of your home is a heavy blanket, a temporary peace that feels fragile and easily broken. You've been thinking about pride and punishment, about what it means to cross a line you didn't even know existed. But what about the other side of the coin? What about those who tried to do everything right, who were devout and pious, but still found themselves on the wrong side of the god's temper? The Roman gods weren't just punishing the arrogant. Sometimes they were punishing the pious, the very people who dedicated their lives to serving them. The price of piety was often just as high as the price of hubris. Imagine you're a Vestal virgin. This is a very big deal. You've been chosen at a young age to serve the goddess Vesta, to tend the sacred flame in her temple in the Roman Forum. This flame is a symbol of Rome itself, and as long as it burns, Rome will prosper. Your job is to make sure it never, ever goes out. This is not a gig for the faint of heart. The rewards are immense. You have a position of honour, great influence, and a level of independence that most Roman women could only dream of. But the risks are terrifying. The Vestal Virgins were a sacred order, a living embodiment of Rome's connection to the divine. Their chastity was paramount. a symbol of their purity and their dedication to Vesta. If a Vestal virgin broke her vow of chastity, the consequences were unthinkable. She wasn't just executed, she was buried alive. You have to understand the horror of that. She would be led to a small, underground chamber, given a small amount of bread and water, and then the chamber would be sealed. The idea was that the state wasn't directly killing her, she was just being left to the gods. It was a terrifyingly subtle way of saying, we did our part, and the gods will do theirs. This was a punishment not for a crime against the state, but for a crime against a god. This was the price of a religious transgression, and it was a public spectacle designed to terrify and humble the entire city. But what if a Vestal virgin, through no fault of her own, let the sacred flame go out? Maybe she fell asleep. Maybe she was distracted. Maybe a gust of wind put it out. It didn't matter. The consequence was the same. She would be stripped, beaten, and then brought before the Pontifex Maximus for punishment. Again. The punishment was a public display of shame and divine retribution. This wasn't about a lack of effort. This was about a lack of perfection. The gods demanded perfection, and they didn't care about your excuses. It's a classic example of a less-known detail. The Romans saw no distinction between a deliberate transgression and an accidental one when it came to their most sacred duties. An error was an error, and the gods were not in the business of forgiveness. This brings us to a crucial point about the nature of Roman piety. It wasn't about having a personal, loving relationship with a god. It was about a series of transactions, a strict adherence to a contract. You did your part, the sacrifices, the prayers, the rituals, and the gods, in theory, would do theirs. You were in a state of constant negotiation with the divine, and you had to be meticulous in your adherence to the rules. A simple mistake could be seen as an act of disrespect, a violation of the sacred contract. It wasn't enough to just have good intentions. You had to have perfect execution. Think about a farmer who dedicates a portion of his harvest to Ceres, the goddess of agriculture. He makes his prayers. He performs the correct rituals. He leaves the grain on her altar. He thinks he's done everything right. But maybe, just maybe, he forgets to add a certain type of flower to the offering, a small detail that was part of a very old tradition. Ceres, in her divine wisdom, or maybe just her divine pettiness, takes offense. She doesn't destroy his entire harvest. That would be too simple. Instead, she might send a small, creeping blight that only affects a portion of his crops, leaving him with just enough to survive, but not enough to prosper. She might make his family a little bit sick, a persistent cough that never quite goes away. The punishment is slow, insidious, and deeply personal. It's a constant, nagging reminder that he has failed, and that the gods are watching. The story of the Vestal virgins and the sacred flame is a powerful metaphor for the Roman relationship with the gods. It was a relationship built on fear and duty, not love and faith. You didn't worship the gods because you felt a deep sense of spiritual connection. You worshipped them because you were terrified of what they would do if you didn't. The stories of piety going wrong were a constant reminder that even your best efforts were not always enough. You could do everything right, and still find yourself on the wrong side of a divine temper tantrum. The debate among historians on this topic is intense. Some argue that the Roman religion was a deeply cynical system of social control, a way of keeping the populace in line through a constant state of fear. Others argue that it was a sincere expression of a very real belief system, a way of grappling with a chaotic and unpredictable world. The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in the middle. The rituals, the ceremonies, and the terrifying punishments were all part of a larger system that gave the Romans a sense of order and control in a world that often felt out of control. It was a way of making sense of plagues, famines, and natural disasters. It was a way of saying, this happened because a god was angry, and we know exactly why, and we know how to fix it. So, As you lay in the darkness of your home, you're not just hoping that you haven't angered a god, you're also hoping that you haven't done anything to be too good, either. You're hoping that your piety is just right, not too much, not too little. You're hoping that you've done all the right things, in all the right ways, and that the gods will simply leave you alone. The burden of perfection is a heavy one, and it's a burden that every Roman carried. The silence of the night is a fragile thing, a temporary truce in a war that has been going on since the beginning of time, and you're hoping, with all your heart, that you don't do anything to break that truce. The night has grown deeper, and you're now in that space between waking and sleeping, where thoughts and fears can take on a life of their own. You've been thinking about the Vestal Virgins, and the impossible standard of perfection they had to live up to. It's a terrifying thought, but there's a place even more terrifying in the Roman imagination, a place that makes the fear of a misplaced ritual seem almost quaint. We're talking about the underworld, the land of the dead, a place ruled by a god who wasn't just angry or petty, but who was indifferent, and whose terrifying power was absolute. Pluto, or as the Greeks called him, Hades. He was the king of the underworld, the god of the dead, and the master of all the riches that came from beneath the earth minerals, precious metals, and, of course, the souls of the departed. He wasn't a god of fire and brimstone in the way a modern mind might think. He was a god of cold, silent, and final indifference. His realm was a place of shadows and murmurs, a place of no return. You didn't go to the underworld to be tortured for your sins. You went there to simply be, to exist as a shade, a pale echo of your former self, in a grey and joyless landscape. This is a key difference between Roman and modern religious thought. The Romans believed in a sort of afterlife, but it wasn't a place of reward or punishment for most people. For the vast majority, the underworld was just the underworld, a place of endless waiting. You could, however, earn the wrath of Pluto and his queen, Proserpina, and this was a very bad thing indeed. Unlike the other gods, who you could appease with sacrifices and prayers, Pluto was a god of finality. He didn't want your offerings, he didn't want your prayers, he wanted your soul, and he was patient. He would get it eventually. The terrifying part was that if you offended him, he could make your journey to the underworld a lot more difficult. Imagine you're a Roman citizen, and you've just died. Your family has performed all the proper burial rituals. They've washed your body, placed a coin in your mouth for Charon the ferryman, and performed the final funeral rites. The soul, they believed, was supposed to make a smooth transition to the underworld. But what if you had offended Pluto in your life? Maybe you had stolen from a mine, a sacred place of his domain, or maybe you had desecrated a graveyard, a place under his direct control. You find yourself a restless soul, a ghost trapped in the land of the living, unable to cross the river Styx. You'd be doomed to wander the earth for eternity, a phantom in a world that could no longer see or hear you. This was a fate worse than death. It was the ultimate divine punishment, an eternal life of loneliness and despair. The story of Orpheus and Eurydice is a perfect illustration of the dangers of dealing with the underworld. Orpheus, a legendary musician, descends into the underworld to retrieve his wife, Eurydice, who has died from a snake bite. His music is so beautiful, so moving, that it softens the hearts of Pluto and Proserpina. They agree to let Eurydice return to the land of the living, but on one condition: Orpheus must walk ahead of her, and he cannot look back at her until they are both safely in the upper world. This is a classic divine bargain, a test of trust and faith. And what happens? Orpheus, in a moment of doubt, looks back at the last possible second, and Eurydice is pulled back into the darkness forever. This story isn't just about a tragic love affair, it's a story about the absolute finality of the underworld. Pluto doesn't make deals for fun. He makes them to remind you that his word is law, and that any violation of that law has permanent, irreversible consequences. A less known detail about the underworld is the importance of proper burial rites. The Romans believed that an unburied person was a danger to the living, a restless ghost that could cause all sorts of problems. This is because their soul could not properly enter the underworld. They were trapped, a source of divine displeasure, and they could bring bad luck and misfortune to their family and their community. So, the act of burying the dead wasn't just about showing respect to the deceased. It was a crucial part of maintaining the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods, and ensuring that Pluto stayed in his own realm, and that the dead stayed where they belonged. To neglect this duty was to invite divine trouble. It was a pragmatic and terrifying way of dealing with death. The academic debate on the underworld is a complex one. Did the Romans truly believe in a single, unified underworld with a king and a queen, or was their belief system more fragmented, with local legends and different ideas about what happened after death? It's a fascinating question. While the stories of Pluto and Proserpina were certainly widespread, the Romans were also a practical people, and they had a very pragmatic approach to death and burial. The rituals were all about making sure the dead didn't cause problems for the living. The fear of Pluto wasn't just a fear of eternal torment. It was a fear of cosmic disruption, a fear that the natural order of things would be disturbed, and that you would be the one to pay the price. So, as you lay in the darkness, and you feel the weight of the earth beneath you, you think about Pluto. You think about the silent, indifferent power that he holds. You haven't done anything to offend him. You haven't desecrated a grave or stolen from a mine, but you know that your time will come eventually, and you hope that when it does, you've lived a life that was good enough, pious enough, that your journey to the underworld will be a smooth one. You hope that your family will perform all the correct rituals, and that you won't be a restless ghost, a permanent reminder of a life that was lived and lost. The quiet of the night isn't just a quiet, it's the silent, indifferent presence of a God who is waiting, and who will, eventually, claim you as his own. The stillness of the night is absolute now, a thick velvety quiet that presses in on your senses. You're lying in the darkness, the faint, comforting glow of the moon filtering through your window. But even in this deepest part of the night, you are not alone. There are other gods, smaller gods, but no less powerful, who share your home and your life. They are the La Familiaris, the household gods, and their presence is both a comfort and a constant source of anxiety. These aren't the grand, city-wide gods like Jupiter or Venus. The La Familiaris were the spirits of your ancestors, the departed souls of your family who continue to watch over the home. They resided in the Lararium, a small shrine in your home, and they were the most intimate and immediate of all the Roman deities. You didn't just pray to them on festival days, you prayed to them every morning, you gave them a portion of every meal, and you included them in every family celebration. They were a part of your family, and their well-being was directly tied to yours. Neglecting the La Familiaris wasn't just a matter of disrespect, it was a cosmic insult to your own family line. If you failed to make the proper daily offerings, if you let their shrine fall into disrepair, or if you simply forgot about them, you were essentially severing the connection between the living and the dead. The consequences were not a dramatic lightning bolt or a shipwreck. They were a slow, creeping rot that would infect your entire life. Your family's health could mysteriously decline. Your business could fail for no apparent reason, and your home could feel cold and unwelcoming. It was a spiritual malaise, a deep, pervasive sense of bad luck that followed you everywhere. The Romans believed that the La Familiaris were the guardians of the home, the protectors of its physical and spiritual integrity. They were the ones who kept the bad spirits out, who ensured the prosperity of the family, and who watched over the children. To offend them was to leave yourself and your family defenseless. Imagine that. You're not just dealing with the wrath of a god, you're dealing with the wrath of your own ancestors. You're dealing with the very people who loved you and cared for you in life, now coming back to haunt you in death. It's a terrifying thought, a kind of betrayal that runs deeper than any other. A less-known detail about the La Familiaris is that they were not just the spirits of a single family. The term could also refer to the guardian spirits of a neighbourhood or a city. There were public shrines to the Laos at crossroads and in the public spaces of Rome, and they were an integral part of the city's spiritual life. They were a reminder that the city itself was a kind of family, and that the well-being of the whole was tied to the well-being of its parts. To neglect a public shrine to the Lares was to invite misfortune not just on yourself, but on your entire community. It was a civic duty as much as a religious one. The academic debate on the La Familiaris is a fascinating one. Some scholars argue that they were a form of ancestor worship, a way for the Romans to honour and remember their family members who had passed on. Others argue that they were more of a social construct, a way of enforcing family loyalty and a sense of shared identity. The truth is probably a mix of both. The La Familiaris were a powerful force in the lives of the Roman people, a constant reminder of the importance of family, duty and tradition. They were the glue that held the Roman family together, a spiritual foundation that was as important as any physical structure. So, as you lay in the darkness and you feel the weight of your family's history, you are also feeling the presence of your La Familiaris. You know they are there, a silent, watchful presence in the corner of your room. You haven't forgotten them. You've made your offerings, you've said your prayers, and you've kept their shrine clean. You're not doing it out of love, or even out of a deep sense of faith. You're doing it out of a deep, abiding sense of fear. You're doing it because you know that the greatest punishments don't always come from the grand gods on Mount Olympus. Sometimes they come from the quiet, watchful spirits in your own home. The quiet of the night is a fragile thing, a temporary truce in a war that has been going on since the beginning of time, and you're hoping, with all your heart, that you don't do anything to break that truce. The night is at its deepest, the darkness so complete it feels almost physical. You've been thinking about the gods of your home, the La Familiaris, and the quiet terror of their watchful presence. But the gods of Rome weren't confined to the city walls or the temples. They were everywhere. They were in the trees, in the streams, in the fields and forests, and the farther you got from the organised, structured religion of Rome, the more unpredictable and dangerous these local gods and spirits became. Imagine you're a Roman farmer, living on the outskirts of the city. You're not a great orator or a powerful senator. You're just a man with a piece of land and a family to feed. Your life is dictated by the seasons, the sun and the rain, but it's also dictated by the lesser deities, the local legends, and the spirits of the countryside. These weren't the grand, mythic figures you heard about in the city. These were the gods of the immediate world around you, and they were, in their own way, far more terrifying. Take Sylvanus, for example. He was the god of uncultivated woodlands and fields, the protector of flocks and herds, and the guardian of farmers. Sounds nice, right, a sort of friendly, rustic deity. But Sylvanus also had a dark side. He was a god of untamed nature, and he could be a malevolent force. The Romans believed that he could bring a sudden and terrifying death to anyone who ventured too deep into his forests. They would sacrifice a pig to him before cutting down a tree, not just to ask for permission, but to ask for his mercy. To offend Sylvanus was to invite a kind of rural horror into your life. You might find your livestock mysteriously dying, your crops failing to sprout, or your family getting lost in the woods, never to be seen again. He was a god of the wild, and you learned very quickly to respect the wild. Then there are the fauns, the goat-legged spirits of the forests. They weren't just mischievous sprites, they were a source of terror and paranoia. The Romans believed that the fauns could cause nightmares, and that a sudden, unexplained fear that came over you in a quiet place was called a panic, a word derived from the Greek god Pan, the faun's mythological counterpart, the sound of a footstep in the woods, a rustle in the bushes, a sudden feeling of dread. It was all attributed to the fauns. To offend a faun, a seemingly harmless act like disturbing their sacred grove, was to invite a state of constant psychological torment. You would be plagued by nightmares, by a constant feeling of being watched, and by an unending sense of terror. It was a punishment that didn't just affect your body, but your mind. A less known detail about these lesser deities is the concept of the genius loci, the spirit of the place. The Romans believed that every single place, a field, a forest, a river, a building had its own guardian spirit. You couldn't just build a house on a piece of land without first making an offering to the genius loci. You had to ask for permission, and you had to continue to honour that spirit as long as you lived there. To neglect the genius loci was to build your home on a foundation of divine anger. You might find that your house was constantly falling into disrepair, that strange noises would keep you up at night, and that a general sense of unease would permeate your life. It was a constant reminder that you were a guest on this earth, and that you had to show the proper respect to your hosts. The academic debate on these lesser deities and local legends is intense. Some historians argue that they were a holdover from older, pre-Roman belief systems, a sort of folk religion that existed alongside the grand, state-sponsored religion of Rome. Others argue that they were an integral part of the Roman religious landscape, a way of giving a spiritual reality to the everyday world. The truth is probably a mix of both. The Romans were pragmatic people, and they knew that the world was a dangerous place. The stories of Sylvanus and the fauns were a way of making sense of that danger, of giving a name and a face to the things that could go wrong in the countryside. The fear of these gods wasn't a matter of theological debate, it was a matter of survival. So, as you lay in the darkness, you're not just thinking about the gods in the city, you're thinking about the gods of the world outside your window. You're thinking about the rustle of the leaves in the night, the distant call of an owl, the shifting shadows. You're hoping that you haven't offended a genius loci by a careless word or a forgotten offering. You're hoping that Sylvanus is in a good mood, and that the fauns are sleeping peacefully in their woods. The quiet of the night is a fragile thing, a temporary truce in a war that has been going on since the beginning of time, and you're hoping, with all your heart, that you don't do anything to break that truce. The darkness is lifted, and a new day is dawning. A faint light, the colour of wet slate, is seeping in through the cracks in your shutters. You can hear the city beginning to stir, the distant clatter of a cart on cobblestones, the soft murmur of people beginning their day. The fears of the night, the terror of gods both great and small, are beginning to recede. But you know, with a deep, abiding certainty, that they are not gone. The consequences of offending a god weren't just a matter of a single, dramatic punishment. They were a scar on your life, a permanent mark that would follow you to your grave. The Roman stories of divine vengeance weren't just about the initial act of retribution. They were about the lasting effects, the slow and insidious ways that a god's anger could destroy a life. Take the story of Tiresias, the blind prophet. He was a figure of immense power and wisdom, but his blindness was a direct result of divine anger. The stories vary, but in one version, he sees the goddess Minerva bathing. A direct look at a god in their most private moments is an act of profound disrespect. As punishment, she blinds him, but while in a moment of mercy, she also gives him the gift of prophecy. So, he is not just blind, he is eternally burdened with a terrible gift, a life lived in a state of constant, cosmic irony. His punishment wasn't just a loss of sight, it was a complete and utter transformation of his life, a permanent state of being that was a direct result of a divine transgression. Another example is the story of Echo, a nymph who was a favourite of Jupiter's. Jupiter, being the philanderer that he was often with other nymphs, and his wife, Juno, was constantly trying to catch him. Echo, to protect Jupiter, would distract Juno with long, rambling conversations, giving Jupiter enough time to escape. When Juno finally found out, she was, to put it mildly, furious. Her punishment for Echo was not a quick and easy one. She cursed her, taking away her ability to speak and leaving her with only the power to repeat the last words she heard. Echo's punishment wasn't physical, it was a social, psychological, and existential one. She was forever a passive, voiceless presence, a permanent echo of other people's words. Her life, her identity, was utterly and irrevocably changed. A less known detail about divine consequences is the concept of a sarser. A sarser was a person who had committed a profound religious crime, an act of impietas so severe that they were declared sacred to the gods. This wasn't a good thing. It meant they were outside the protection of the law, and that anyone who killed them would be performing a kind of sacrifice. The sarker was a human sacrifice in all but name, a living embodiment of divine wrath. Their punishment wasn't just a death sentence, it was a social death sentence, a complete and utter excommunication from the world of the living. It's a chilling reminder that the consequences of offending a god weren't always a direct act of violence. Sometimes, the gods made you an object of fear and dread, a living reminder of what happens when you cross a line. The academic debate on the lasting consequences of divine vengeance is a fascinating one. Some historians argue that these stories were a way for the Romans to grapple with the idea of fate and destiny. The gods didn't just punish you, they set you on a new, unchangeable path. Others argue that these stories were a powerful tool of social control, a way of enforcing norms and conformity by showing the terrifying consequences of stepping out of line. The truth, as always, is probably a mix of both. The stories of Tiresias and Echo were a way of giving a spiritual explanation to the suffering and misfortune that people experienced in their lives. They were a way of saying, this happened for a reason, and that reason was a powerful and often terrifying God. So, as the new day dawns, and the sounds of life begin to fill the air, you are not just a Roman citizen getting ready for your day. You are a person living in a world where the gods are a constant, terrifying presence. You are carrying the weight of 1,000 stories, 1,000 warnings, 1,000 tales of divine consequences that are not just myths. They are a part of the very fabric of your world. You're hoping that today you don't do anything to attract their attention. You're hoping that you can live your life in peace, that your piety will be enough, and that the gods, for today at least, will leave you alone.